So welcome to what I believe is the fourth talk in this series of talks where I discuss part three of the book, Things We Could Design for More Than Human-Centered Worlds. And part three is about discussion about the designer. So what or who is the designer in the nomadic practice of designing things? Part two, I discussed things. And in part one, I discussed design. Now, at the outset of the book, I said that this would be a critical and creative speculation about post-humanist design or more than human centered design. And I think in many respects, part one and part two are what I would call the critical aspects of the speculation, the kind of analytical work, trying to describe what is design in this context and what is a thing. And now, in many respects, part three moves on to the creative or generative speculation of what it is to be a designer, but this is now conditioned in many respects. It's shaped or informed by a lot of the post-humanist concepts that we have worked through to this point, namely relationality, technicity, distributed agency. So given all of this, given that analytical work, what can we say of the designer? How might we describe what a designer is? And here I talk about a designer not in exclusively human terms, but a designer is an assembly of humans and non-humans, just accepting the distributed agency of non-humans or the more than human understanding of the world, that it's not just humans that have effect. And so that it contribute to what it is, to what a designer does, to the making and shaping of things. Now, in this part, there are, I would say, three concepts that to really think about or to walk away with, and the two main ones. One is biography, so thinking about the designer, inclusive of non-humans or a more than human approach, as forming biographies. So the designer is a biography. And then the second is the collective structure that deals with some of the politics that we talked about in the last part, and necessity to actually think about these things very much as part of the design process, even before we think about the designer or what things might be designed, in what I call a constituency. So those are two important parts. I'll focus on those. And then the third concept is, and it relates to the idea that you, me, we are the human designers, so to speak, within this assembly of humans and non-humans. And so what is our particular role or unique role? And I describe that as a speaking subject. So those are the three concepts to really focus on: biographies, constituency, and speaking subject. So if you recall in chapter 3, I opened up actually with a long passage I quoted by Joni Ives, the former VP of Design at Apple, where he, as a 6-year-old, was talking about his encounter with the Braun Citromatic juicer, and of course reflecting some 40 years later and really talking about this as the principles and the genius of Dieter Rams, the German designer, the designer of many of the Braun's products. And here we can start to see this idea of designer's biography, even in some sense here, where Dieter Rams as a designer is woven together with the Citromatic juicer, or the Citromatic juicer is so interconnected with Dieter Rams that they form a biography together. It's part of his biography, and the Citromatic juicer will always be connected to Dieter Rams. And so, this makes sense in terms of the nomadic practice of designing objects, because designers, the individual designers, are held up very much so in that practice. But nevertheless, it's this idea that they are bound together. And Dieter Rams, even as he passes away, he will always be connected to the Citromatic juicer, and the Citromatic juicer will always be connected to Dieter Rams. So in some sense, they form a biography together. And so this is one way of thinking about biographies. Designer is a biography. But we can extend that. If you recall in the book, I talked about autobiographical design, in which designers design for themselves. But what I wanted to pull out, focus on there, in this example by Audrey Desjardins in her work living in a prototype in which she lived in the environment in which she was actually designing. What does it mean to design the space that she lives in? It's a fairly mundane kind of activity, but when it's focused like this, you get the sense of the designer constructing, living in the, cohabiting with the things it designs. And so in a sense, and this is when we think about purely the human designer, but we can extend this to the idea of a non-human assembly and human assembly of designers. But there's a very notion of cohabiting. So being a designer, being radically situated with the things they design, that the things that we design are together with in the world that we live in. And this is very different than how we typically exercise design, whether it be artifacts or products or objects, that often we think about designing for clients, or we think about designing for others. We separate out the life world of what is the thing going to habit from us as a designer. And it's this separation that I would like to address. But to go back to this radically situated, here's another example by Angela Mackey, who was completing her PhD here at Eindhoven, and her green screen dress project, in which, as she was constructing this idea, the thing of dynamic fabric, she was living with the green screen dress every day for a year. And you can see that the thing she was designing was literally cohabiting her everyday life. And so designer, thing, and co-shaped, co-constructed life world were all one and the same. So in thinking about these examples of Angela Mackey and Audrey Desjardins of autobiographical design is very much a method that's at the margins of the way in which we design. And I would, I think that this idea, there's not enough separation. The problem with it in most traditional design is there's not enough separation between our own lives. We don't design for ourselves, we design for others. And so there's not enough separation between the things, the connection between the designer and the things. Although I want to foreground that, and in large part also to foreground the way in which we cohabit a world together, and what does that mean? And how does that actually make us more accountable? And how is that a principle of design with? So when I chose the word biography, in part biography, and biography in this post-humanist sense. So biography is made up of the word bios, and bios meaning life. And in this context, I think life force, or what I go on to call the designer as force, which is both the human life and the non-human life. We think about the distributed agencies and how these together share a life or create a life that has effects in the world, is ongoing, is a set of agentic capacities, which we'll talk about again. But this shared life that is created between the thing and the designer, the Dieter-Rams and the systematic juicer, and what the effects of that are. But the second part of biography is graphe, which is to write. And so typically, a biography is understood as the written life of somebody, but I'm thinking about it very differently, much more expansively. That graphe is that the thing between designer and thing that's made, and how it inscribes itself into the world, how it shapes and the effects that it creates. But also, at the end of the biography, what does it leave behind? And so in that sense, it's accountable, more accountable. And I've talked about this last class. We designers, we tend to think only about the making, the creating of something, and not the ending of something. And we're far less accountable for what we leave behind, as well as what we put into the world. So this designer as force kind of brings us back to this idea of agentic capacities. This is now beginning to understand, where we looked at in part 2, the ways in which things exist in the world, but if they are vital and have agentic capacities, well, then they also contribute as a designer. So this helps us to understand how a designer is made up of both humans and non-humans that have effect, and they shape the way, the outcomes of design. They make things along with us. And they do this through this notion of agentic capacities and the different characteristics. And in last class, we focused a lot on the relationship between causality and trajectory. Although I think in this sense, in particular about as a designer, what's most important really is the relationship between trajectory and efficacy. And I'll talk about causality later, the idea of origins, which is specific to the human role in this designer that is both humans and non-humans. But this idea that there are certain trajectories that create particular things, and this shows how non-humans or things also design. I gave the example in the book. This is by it's also a concept plus an example. This is a French philosopher by the name of Gilbert Simondon, and his idea of concretization. And he gave the example of the gimbal turbine is a hydro generating a turbine that would be in the water, and talked about how it related to itself in many respects, that it was the concretization of the parts in connecting to itself and to its environment around it. And it was the trajectory that really created efficacies, which in a sense he calls concretization, which created efficiencies within the turbine. So the part demands another very particular kind of part, rather than we just design something anew. But we already experienced this, or have already encountered this in the idea of the Lichtline Plus in the intersection of Bodegraven, that the very trajectories of traffic intersections of the changing lights and the navigation across the intersection and targeting particular human things, whether that be a car and driver or a cyclist and bicycle, that in a sense that trajectory resulted in the efficacy of the Lichtline Plus, of another human thing, that's the mobile phone user. So in some sense, the traffic intersection is what created, or definitely contributed to the creation of the Lichtline Plus. So if we think about this designer as force, these kinds of human and non-human trajectories, or agentic capacities of trajectories that create things, in this distributed agency form, in this more than human form. And we think about this in biographical terms, then how does this help us understand the things that we design, or the things that we want to design? How do we think about not just what we make, but what we make and its effect in the world and how that's tied to us? We jointly do that. But also how we inscribe ourselves into the world and what we leave behind. And so I use the example here of what's called the Children Village, which is a dormitory for remote school in Canoana in northern part of Brazil, by the architectural firm Aleph Zero, along with the designer Marco Rosenbaum. And here I think is a really good example of biography, thinking about the effect in the world, the joint effect in the world, and the inscription into the world and what you leave behind. The dormitory is made up of few materials, mostly the wood, which is made of eucalyptus trees, which are local to the area, and eucalyptus trees were introduced to Brazil in the 19th century. And so they were milled from trees nearby. The other main component are bricks, mud bricks that were literally from the soil that was excavated for the site. And so those are the two main components, along with the sheet metal roof over top that would eventually oxidize and rust. And the way to think about this is not only the way it kind of inhabits it beautifully, just aesthetically and functionally, and in terms of just its sets of relations, it cohabits that particular world or space quite beautifully, but it extends beyond that in the biographical terms, it's also what it leaves behind. And we can think about the eventual decay of the Children Village, not that it's going to last like this forever, and the eucalyptus will rot back into the very locale it came from, as will the bricks and the soil. It will literally inscribe itself in the most minimal sense, or return to the very place as a resource. It will actually generate anew. And I think this is a wonderful example of how we might think about design, or designer as, and the things made as a biography, and what we might do with that notion of biography. Now, what's useful in that term biography is, I think it's another way of thinking about sustainability, but this is the way in which you have to think about all the things that we design. But there's nothing inherently good about a biography, so this leads me to the notion of anti-biographies. And unfortunately, much of what we design in the world is what I would call anti-biographies. That is, things that do function within this reality of distributed agency of things and relationality, but do in a way that is not a matter of designing with, that excludes things that are non-human, and that tends to focus and exercise, again, a kind of degree of human exceptionalism that actually has a negative impact. This is a patent by Sten Gustav Thulin. I think it was 1965. And in many ways, this is, to me, a symbolic of a kind of classic notion of design, a design problem, and an elegant solution to a design problem. It has a certain kind of simplicity. It uses very few a simplicity of, I think, its design, its actions, and its ability to scale inexpensively and to have a big effect. It's a patent that shows polyethylene material that's folded over once and then cut in rectangles, and then there are some cutaways. Again, when you think about, well, how do I do this? This represents what I think we could call the design problem. And in many respects, this is an elegant solution. Now, the problem with the design problem is that it's so exclusionary of all the things we've talked about. It doesn't take into account the trajectory or the agentic capacities and the ongoing efficacies of things. It doesn't take into account the politics that will start to be part of the other concerns that people might have other than just convenience. It doesn't take into account the ultimate biography that will be formed in relation to the plastic bag. So this patent for a plastic bag, this scaling up, and we know what the effects of this are. We know the trillions of tons of waste and garbage this is created. They're floating in gyres throughout the various oceans in our world. Something that we're now scaling back and through regulations and through legislation. Another example of this that draws, again, on the kind of non-human trajectories of data and data collection and what can be done with that data, and in the sense of a product. And so the example was the weather app by the Weather Channel. And I think, this is, in some ways, initially the point was to collect location data so it could localize the data for the user. So the weather obviously was where they were, and this has a great convenience and it fits many of the principles of user-centered design. However, the very trajectory of data collection, location data collection, quickly takes on a life of its own, and it has its own sets of efficacy, and these efficacies, what becomes an anti-biography, are taken advantage of, that more and more data is wanting to be collected by the makers of these apps, who can then sell it to other marketers, who can create consumer profiles, and so on. And more data is collected, and more data is collected freely and surreptitiously. I cited an article in the New York Times in which they bought 4 months of location data from one of these brokers of our private data that are collected without us knowing. And they were able to trace the daily activity on a 24-hour cycle of one particular individual. And even though the data was anonymous, they were able to identify who that individual was simply by connecting their location of their home to their workplace. And that could be enough to say they knew exactly who this person was, a school teacher in New York City. And they could map her every activity over 4 months. In fact, the location data that was collected was up to 8,600 times, or every 20 minutes. And there are instances in which people's data was collected 14,000 times a day, which is up to 6 seconds a day, depending on the various mobile apps that they had running on their phone. And this trajectory, which would then become anti-biography, because this trajectory of forever more collecting data and creating efficacies of more and more information on us and more profiles, and monetizing that is what Shoshana Zuboff calls the age of surveillance capitalism, taking surplus data and turning it into products, and turning data into products, and turning it freely and doing it surreptitiously and invading our privacy, and all at the same time. And I used the example just to return to Robert Rosenberger's callous objects and the discussions we have about, and also the camera obscura 1C, the trajectory of the concrete. And here we see a trajectory in a very different sense, and this combines to create the Camden bench, which is a good example of a dominant stability and exclusionary kind of public space. So, what the design problem does is it excludes all the things I just talked about. The ethical questions about what is created here, the effects that this has on the world in terms of sustainability, the asymmetries, the exclusions of collecting someone's data freely and unknowingly in order to make money, to make certain people rich while other people are really quite unknowing and unwittingly a part of this, turned into products themselves. These are ultimately political. This is what Bruno Latour called thing politics, and we had a bit of a discussion of this last class, that everything is political, in the sense that everything has a set of contradictions to it. There are issues of negotiation, there are elements of power. They're like in the very interpretive nature of what things are, and the fact that things create new things, so to speak, and these in a sense also always need to be negotiated. The effects are always changing. This is what we mean by politics, and this is attached to everything that is made. So this brings me to the second concept in this part, this idea of constituency. And it was really a question of, well, there's nothing inherent about my biographies are always in effect. The distributed agency of the more than human distributed agency is always in effect. And we do inscribe ourselves in the world. We do leave things behind with the things that we make. But there's nothing inherent to a biography that says it'll be a good biography, so to speak, what we value, what we want, how we cohabit, how we design with, versus the anti-biographies, which I would argue are all not design with biographies. They don't take into account a better way, a sustainable way to cohabit and live in the world that we shape and make. And so a constituency is also thinking through the thing politics, and the challenge we have with when we reduce things down to simply a design problem, where we exclude all of the things we situate the problem. We find ways, designers construct the design problem, but we construct the design problem in such a way that we can solve it. That's the very point of it. And in a way in which we can focus on certain things at the exclusion of other things, other aspects, and most of which, what is excluded are all the things that make an anti-biography. And so I think that this is the point of constituency, one we need to think much more broadly, and not just conceptually, but collectively and as a matter of action. And so that's what the constituency is, and it's to bring in these thing politics, to bring in and accept the distributed agency and make that more than human and make that very much part of the design process. To think before we even have a designer, to act before we have a designer, and act before we design something. So this idea of design with, and a constituency really tries to bring in these matters of concern. What are the effects? What are the values that you want? What do we attach to the things that we might make, or the things that we have, or how we might think about things in the future. But it's also what we could call the matters of care. If we think back about the children village, which is not only about trying to think about what needed to be brought together to design this particular children village in a way that cohabited the world, but it was a matter of care. How do we show care in the way we do that, not just to ourselves, but to others, in our relationality and our interconnectedness that accounts for distributed agency? So the word thing actually has a dual meaning. I think clearly we've talked about what a thing is, and I give a very specific understanding of a thing, which is related to in ways that we generally use the word thing, like that thing over there and this thing over there is relating to something, an object or whatever. I won't say an object because I'll get caught up in all my nomadic practices discussion, but there is an entity. But the word thing actually has its origins in Norse culture, and etymology goes back to thing actually meant to thing, to gather. And gather as a place to negotiate, to work through these matters of concerns, to work through politics. In fact, in Iceland, the term originates in a place in Iceland called the Althing, which is the original parliament. Literally, it was a place in which people would gather and they would bring the things that might be under dispute, and they would negotiate. And in fact, in Iceland, the parliament is still called the Althing. And so the other meaning is to gather. And so the way I like to think about a constituency is to gather before things, or things before things, and to gather before we think about who is going to design, or what is going to design, and what is the thing that's going to be designed, and to work through what is important to us. So a constituency is the assembly of humans and non-humans from which designers are gathered to go on to design things and form biographies. So this, I think, is one of the most important things when it comes to nomadic practice designing things, and where we need to shift our attention as designers is how do we form these constituencies, and what does that mean, and how do we do this in the most expansive way that includes the participation in a more than human sense. Now, we have a good starting point, but a very narrowed version of a constituency, a proto-constituency, what we might call a design practice or a design studio. This is my own everyday design studio, and it clearly is a place that we gather those who are going to design are going to gather and think about who we're going to design for, and also gather with the people with whom we're going to design for, or be part of our research, part of our studies. There are the things that we made that shape who we are and shape what we will do and shape how we'll act in the world and what the decisions we'll make. And the things are also very much part of the constituency. And there's the materials that we use, the methods we use, the techniques we use, the tools we use, which are all part of the constituency. And then there's the institutional context that we're in, the university, the funding that we have, the policies we have to follow, the rules we have to follow, the regulations we have to follow, are all part of this constituency, or proto-constituency, because it's still very narrow. I think in my own everyday design studio, we're too focused on academia. We're focused on academic research. We're not necessarily enlisting the participation or enrolling the participation in a more than human sense to the degree we need to. But it's a beginning point. It's a way to start to think about focusing more attention and more purpose to the idea of the gathering before we design. A metaphor, in a way, I borrow this from Tim Ingold, but I think it shaped it in a way that makes sense with constituencies, is I like to use this idea of the kitchen. And what I also love is that there are so many different ways in which you can have a kitchen, as these images show, whether this is through matters of ethnicity, matters of culture, matters of history, matters of place, that a kitchen is not there. There are different ways in which we gather to think about think about food, but what we will gather in the kitchen, and not just who, but what. What are the materials? What are the tools? What are the ingredients? What are the furniture? Where is it going to be? What place? What's the air going to be? All of these things are gathered up in this kind of this constituency of humans and non-humans. But we also work through the matters of concern. What kind of kitchen is it going to be? To what degree is it going to represent or be a generative space for the ethnicities that we're a part of, the kind of food that we make, the history that it brings together, the locale that we're in, to what degree the ingredients are local, the materials are local, to what degree, is it going to be a vegan kitchen? Is it going to be non-GMO? These matters of concern that relate to the politics of the gathering, and we work these out in large part in the kitchen beforehand, and this accounts for different kinds of kitchens. And all of this, and the way it's interconnected, and all of this before we ever cook a meal, or before we think about who's going to cook or what kind of cook we want. And this very much relates to design. I think this is in an expansive form is what I would call a constituency, this gathering before we think about who or what is going to be the designer and who or what we are going to design, that has the participation in the more than human sense, that works through the matters of concern and does it through matters of care. A kitchen is a very caring place. It pulls things together. We maintain it, we repair it, we keep it going. It's often the liveliest place. So I used the example, another example, to kind of explore this idea of constituency in the book. I'm not going to go into detail here because I think it's covered in really good detail in the book, but this idea of the Life Patch Collective. And I liked it for various reasons. I mean, I think it shows, of course, different examples. This is from Yogyakarta in Indonesia, so there are different backgrounds, different locales, different ethnicities and races that we should consider when we think about design. But also, I think this idea that it had the participation of more than human, whether it was the water in the Yogyakarta River, or the bacteria, or ideas of fermentation, but also the interconnectedness and the political sense, but the interconnectedness in terms of the nation state of Indonesia, where it is, but also the maternal lineage, the parents, the mothers of those that were involved in the life patch. And we talked about that in the very first class when you brought in a thing. We quickly saw how interconnected everything was. I mean, that was the thing after we designed it, but now we want to see this interconnectedness and bring this expansiveness into considering who we are as a designer, and with the full participation, everybody, with a particular focus though, with a set of the matters that we are concerned about and the matters that we care about. So it's not just everything. Okay, so this brings me to the third concept, which is speaking subject, and it's important. Although I'm actually we're not going to discuss it too much in this talk, and I'm really able to set this up as a discussion we have in class. And really what the speaking subject does is, okay, this is all sort of talked about the designer as this assembly of humans and non-human designers, and focus on the agentic capacities of non-humans. But what is our role? What is the role of the human designer in this assembly of human and non-human designers? How do we function? How do we engage? And so I think on the one hand, certainly we engage in design much in the way we do, however, in this more than human context. So we think about this in design with. We are agents that bring about methods, materials, techniques. We are actually the ones that trigger much of what we call design. In terms of agentic capacity, the main characteristic of the human designer is causality, that we are at the origins. We are the ones who say, hey, let's fly a kite, and we bring the kite to the beach, but we don't fly the kite alone. We don't determine the flight path of the kite alone. We do this in concert with other non-humans in this more than human way. And so in many respects, in terms of our agentic capacity, is one of origins or one of causality. We trigger this, but we have this ongoing relationship too. We then are part of the assembly. But let me talk about other specific roles. I think two other specific roles that I see for the speaking subject. One is that, of course, in this, if you think about designers as human and non-humans, well, non-humans don't speak, and we are in a world of language. And in some sense, it is as the one who may be at the origins and argue for the point we need something to be designed, but we might have a rationale, but we have this ongoing communication, which is we speak on behalf of the human and non-human assembly. And it's a tricky role, and as described, because we things will speak for themselves in the ways that they can, and it's not always clear when we are speaking on behalf of ourselves or speaking on behalf of others. But nevertheless, it is in a very important role to be to speak on behalf of the other non-humans in the designer assembly, and to think about this that maintains attention and focus on the more than human participation in the designing of things. So that's one, to be the speaking subject for the designer. And we don't really know how to do this in large part. I mean, in some ways we do. I think designers pay a lot of attention to materials. They pay a lot of attention to processes. They pay a lot of attention to techniques, not just other humans, and develop a lot of methods and techniques to do this and understand what is happening. But I think we can expand on this and build on this much more and think about it much more deeply in this more than human context. And how do we speak? How do we get non-humans to speak, or how do we get them to participate? And this is what I call repertoire. It's a necessity for us, a shift of attention to think about methods, techniques, and tools that are aimed at ensuring that everyone is participating, that are designers in the process. And in some ways, I talked about the term speech prosthesis, which I borrow from Latour, but this idea, if you think about scientists who create tools and techniques to get the things that they're studying to come alive so they can understand them. And the way we can think about this in design terms. So perhaps the one other shift of attention for designers is thinking about developing methods, techniques, and tools which we could call speech prosthesis, which allow for more than human participation as a designer. And the second one is the speaking subject on behalf of the constituency, and that means to gather. Who gathers? Who gathers the kitchen? Who gathers the studio? And it may be done with others, but also who maintains that? Who exercises the matters of care in relation to the constituency? And so this is a very important role, to be the speaking subject of the constituency, and again to ensure this more than human participation and to maintain that. And it's a dynamic; it's ongoing. So I think that convener, gatherer, is the speaking subject of the constituency, and again, I think that is the role in large part of the human designer. So another shift of attention to not only focus on things, before we design, before we have the designer, before the things we make, but to focus on the role of doing the gathering and maintaining the participation of everything and everyone on the constituency. So I will leave it there. I think there's a lot to discuss in class, and I think that this is really the kind of, in the idea of a generative or creative speculation, these are things to fill, aspects to complete, aspects to do, and sort of future action of how we design in the nomadic practice of designing things.